lock your doors, bolt your windows, turn off the lights. You're listening to B. Show Brian's Halloween365. Horror movie commentaries, what ifs, and news, even occasional interviews. Indulge your morbid cinematic delight and pray the Reaper spare you tonight.
I'm back in time for Scream to come out this weekend. My name is B. Show Brian. This is an episode of Halloween 365. It is a podcast. It is a video. We're on YouTube, and I've redone the office setup, so hopefully this will continue for a while. And this was supposed to fade out, and it's just going to fall off there. Gotta love do it yourself. I'm B. Show Brian. Halloween 365 may not be Halloween 365 for a while. Someone brought up the fact that there's another podcast called Halloween 365. And even though I've been doing this, the videos on this YouTube channel for a while under that name, I don't know. I feel like if they were doing the podcast first, I need to make a change. So name may be changing soon. Not sure. Probably something horror in the title or Halloween. Still, that's just between you and me. But I want to do this short and sweet this week. Scream comes out this weekend. I believe it comes out Friday. I record this Tuesday night, Wednesday early morning. Because honestly, growing up as a kid, I heard people talk about how great Scream was. And now with this, fifth installment, sixth installment, there's been a TV show. There's been all these sequels to a movie that I never thought was all that great. Now, I wanted to revisit it. I wanted to give it a fresh look with everyone talking about Scream this past couple weeks in anticipation. I'll be honest with you. I've stayed away because I've been pretty busy with some other things, but I've stayed away from some of the horror movie sites for the past couple weeks. So I can't say for sure that there's been as much buzz as the Halloween movie or some of the other movies that came out last year that were really good. But in my opinion, I just don't think the movie's worth the buzz, to be honest with you. And I hope they make a lot of money. I hope it's good. I hope everyone's successful, especially during these times. But I wanted to revisit Scream with a fresh set of eyes. So that's what we're doing here today. Hoping to get through this in about 30 minutes. Keep it short and sweet. You can get these episodes on the YouTube channel. You can go to Spreaker, find them there. You can go to Halloween 365, search it for now. Available everywhere podcasts are found. Apple. I always want to say iTunes because I'm fucking old. See the gray, popping through. But anywhere podcasts are found, and if you're a member of the Break the Apocalypse Patreon, you'll get these episodes early. So I'll try to put this up on Thursday, and then this episode will probably drop Friday or over the weekend at some point for everyone else. So, all right, batten down the hatches. It's been heralded as one of the most influential, or at least groundbreaking films, horror-wise, of the 1990s. I never understood that. And let me take you back. When I was, 12, 13 years old in 1996, 97, this movie came out and everyone was talking about it. And it was around the time I started getting into horror movies that I remember watching Scream and Scream 2 in 96 and 97 that came out in quick succession. I remember mainstream people watching these movies and thinking they were great. And I remember watching them. I didn't remember being bowled over by them, but I wasn't also as big into horror as I was a year or two later. That would come with Halloween. And it's funny because I wasn't around for the heyday of Halloween in 78, Nightmare on Elm Street, in 1984, Friday the 13th from 1980 through really the heyday was 1987 that it started trailing off. But when I watched those movies, even the worst ones, I just kept going back for more, and they kept satiating that appetite and that addiction, if you will, for those movies. I couldn't get enough. I mean, I was watching the Taste of Horror collection. That's how I found the Black Room, which is a favorite of Mike Scandato from HorrorManiacs. Shout out to them and their podcast. They do weekly reviews. Really good show. Go check them out. But it's a favorite of Mike's. It's a favorite of mine. And now people are starting to discover it because of the internet and because of shows like this one, Break the Apocalypse, and HorrorManiac, or NecroManiacs. So when I think about those movies that shaped my love for horror, Scream was definitely not one of them. And again, I didn't want to be unfair, and I almost did this review cold. And I decided to go watch the movie tonight. Last minute, I said, you know what, I'm going to sit down and watch it, fresh set of eyes, and get into it. And I'm glad I did, because I saw some things that I liked, but it really just reinforced my belief of I have no idea why people thought this was. I have an idea now. I figured it out. But why it's held up even by some horror fans is this influential horror movie. So one really big issue that I had off the bat is a film in 1996 pretending high school kids were up on all the horror movies of the day, or the classic horror movies, okay? This movie, by the way it's set, and there's farmhouses and in the middle of nowhere, it's the typical small town middle America. And yet for some reason, all of these high school kids were probably listening to Real Big Fish and Dave Matthews Band and shit, right? It's 1996. For some reason, they're name dropping Wes Craven, and they're name dropping John Carpenter, and they're talking about the town that dreaded sundown. Terror Train, and it's like that's not even remotely accurate. Not even remotely accurate. I grew up. I'm in a small American town in the Midwest. Okay, I know for sure people didn't know what those movies were in 1996, because that's when I was discovering these movies, and I was a fucking outcast. There was one guy that I knew that knew horror movies and got me into them. I don't talk to him anymore, unfortunately. He used to be a really good friend. But it was he and I. He and I were the only ones, and we were telling people about these movies. And the only reason people watched them is if we drugged people to watch them. If we had a sleepover, we'd sneak one in. No one knew what these movies were. Nobody. Maybe so maybe if you have maybe if you have 6 friends, you, your brother, your brother's friend, your friend, and then like 2 cousins, maybe 1 or 2 of them knew about these movies. Maybe there was one kid who'd watched them all because his brother let him watch these movies. You know what I mean? Like that's, and again, I was in like middle school at the time, and my brother was going into high school. But like even my older cousins who had watched those movies, they couldn't tell you who directed the movies or who wrote them or who started. I mean, it's asinine. So again, I'm in a town and grew up in a town like that during that time, completely unrealistic. And it's funny, it takes some perspective and some hindsight to see that. But just applying it to my experience, it is not at all accurate whatsoever. To me, it was an excuse to drop all of these horror movie references. And I know Kevin Williamson has said that when he wrote this film, he really wanted to see the kind of slasher, teenagers being chased by maniacs and all that, like Halloween, that he'd grown up on. And they weren't making them anymore. Well, that's because they died out in about 1986 after it had run its course. And then the early 90s were really filled with a lot of like TV horror movies. There were movies like Ticks and Mosquito and Arachnophobia. I mean, there's some really cool movies. They're really campy and really cornball, but I think that was the staple. Was you had these sort of serious movies, the slashers, gore fests, things like that. It ramped up, and then as it got more ridiculous, then people started going in the comedic route, and I'll talk about that in a second. But to me, it was an excuse to drop all these references in, which would be fine. It would be fine if you were, like, I'll give you an example. To me, one of the better movies of this teen movie era was, I just had it, was The Faculty. Yes. There were a lot of scenes in The Faculty that were inspired by other movies, like The Thing. It's very similar to The Thing. Rodriguez, in fact, lifted certain shots from it as an homage. There's a difference between subtle homage and putting Halloween on in the background, as the Act 3 progresses to match up with the video on the screen. I don't know. It was a little bit much for me, even as a horror movie fan. I've had to teach myself to say horror. because in talking with John and Shaheen on Break the Apocalypse, I've realized that I don't know if it's my heavy German tongue or if it's just my Midwestern accent that I can't say horror. It doesn't come out right. So, excuse me if I sound like I'm saying the horror. It's forced and I have to do that because if not, it's a head thing. And I trip up like I am now. But like I said, it'd be fine if it was dropped in, subtle, inspired by. But this movie, I mean, from the first act to the last, it was bam, 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 in your face every 5 seconds. So I didn't really like that. And I felt like I think it hinged on it too much, to be fair. I think they still could have done it, but this hinged on it way too much. It kind of used it as a crutch. And, it reminds me, in this movie, it reminded me a lot of some of the more modern films that they're remakes, but they're sequels, but they're not really remakes, and they're not really sequels. It's like, they throw all these Easter eggs in. And this film was chock full of them. Half the movie was Easter eggs, to be honest with you. I just thought it was a little bit much. But it dovetails into that whole meta thing. Like, people say, oh, this movie's so great because it's self-referential, man. I had a conversation with someone I really liked about 2 weeks ago over lunch, and they found out I liked horror movies and proceeded to tell me how the serious horror movies are terrible because they're so cheesy and so corny, and they're always the best when you can laugh at them. And I wanted to fucking strangle this person. I really like this person. I was just, okay. I was just trying to nod and, try to make the conversation go as quick as possible and finish my food so I could go back to what I was doing. And I'm joking when I say that, but, and bless them. Difference of opinion for sure. I don't like that. And I think this movie gets a lot of praise for being meta and self-referential. And I think that's misplaced. People say it's great that it's self-referential. I don't. The thing that I never got about that is the movie constantly calls out how tired and cliched and how bad and corny the tropes of horror movies are, but then proceeds to do every single one non-ironically. Like, I don't know, man. It really bugs me. Like, have you ever known someone like in high school or college who isn't very confident, or they know they're a dork, or they know they're an outcast, so their way of trying to appeal to someone they see as more popular or more influential or someone they want to buddy up to, they just shit on themselves constantly. And maybe they get invited to parties and they're friends with people, but no one really looks at them seriously like they belong. It's like that's the goofy kid that, like, shits his pants on purpose and makes everyone laugh at him. You're not going home with the captain of the cheerleading squad. You're just kind of the goofy guy hanging out. They laugh at you. I'm a wrestling fan. It reminds me of like the 90s when they used to have the general manager of Raw, this celebrity guest host. And every time they would bring in like Jeremy Piven and Dr. Ken, and they would shit on their own show to try to appease or appeal to Hollywood. And no, Hollywood didn't take them seriously. They came on, they got a check, or they got their guest spot, and they got their little rub and got to plug their movie or their book, and then they moved on. It did absolutely zero to help them in pop culture standing. This is the same exact way. And I don't know if it was intentional, but that's what always bugged me about the meta self-referential thing. Like they were talking about I think I might have missed, there was something I was going to talk about. Yeah. I'll get to this, trust me. The bullshit rules for surviving horror movie. This is part of it. But like they're talking about how cringe and cliche these movies are, but like there's too many jump scares. Like how many times in a horror movie have we seen a cat? Like, oh, it's a tense scene. I get Halloween 2, Friday the 13th Part 2, and then there's a slew of others where like there's a tense scene where someone's stalking, like looking around, and you got the steady cam moving around and wobbling, so it feels like someone's watching them. And then they go to open a door or close a window, and a cat jumps out. How many times has that happened? That is one of those cliched tropes in horror movies. Happens in this movie. And it's not like, oh yeah, go figure this would happen. This is a horror movie. Ha 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 ha. It's in this. It's like Mickey Mouse. Woo, I'm a loopy baby, loopy baby. There's a horror movie. Oh, God, can I do that without waking everyone in the house up? There's a cat, kitty cat. Felix. Anyway, let's get back to reality here. But that's what I'm saying is it's not ironic. It's like they're saying, oh, horror movies, oh, it's some shitty fucking virgin and blah, blah, blah. And then the main character is a girl who won't put out. It's like, first of all, who thought that would endear her to anyone watching this movie? Your target audience is high school kids. She's like the bad guy in the movie. Dude comes up and he's like trying to, get some. And she's like, no, only over the clothes and shit. It's like, ugh, get the fuck out. Stab this bitch. First scene. First act, she's gone. Let's move on. Let's see more Rose McGowan. But, too many jump scares. They play into the cliches that they, like, chide and say are terrible and outdated and cornball. Speaking of terrible, the dialogue. Woof. For a movie that's supposed to be like this great turnkey film in the history of horror, the dialogue is bad. And they even in the film, there's a scene in the bathroom. I believe it's the bathroom where there's a cheerleader, unless I just thought of it during this scene. But there's a scene in the movie where someone's talking about, maybe it's Nev. Oh, never mind. Nev Campbell says it on the phone. And then the cheerleader was the scene I thought of immediately after this to reference. Nev Campbell's talking on the phone about how horror movies are just terrible dialogue with people who can't act, blah, blah, blah. Like one of the next scenes is a cheerleader in the bathroom talking to a friend. It's terrible dialogue. It's delivered terribly. And I'm like, well, yeah, you were accurate if you're talking about your own movie, honey. I mean, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's not ironic, like they play it as ironic, but then they do the same shit. So they're really, you know what I mean? Hopefully you guys follow what I'm trying to say here. Is it reminds me a lot of like if Scary Movie, like this movie is like Scary Movie if Scary Movie decided to be somewhat serious. You know what I mean? Like here's a horror parody. Well, let's be a little bit serious with it. It's honestly like a student film I made in high school where we wanted to make a horror comedy, but I still wanted to make it, some parts somewhat serious or try to be somewhat serious. That's what it reminded me of. But the dialogue is terrible. Although the ending line, it's funny because I haven't seen this movie in like 25 years, 20 years, something like that, right after it came out. And I like thought of the last line right before it happened because they're like, this is the part where the killer jumps back to life. And I like Jamie Kennedy. But shout out, Rolling with Saget. R.I.P. Bob Saget. There's a music video he made, Rolling with Bob Saget. It's worth checking out. But he says, this is the part where the killer springs back to life. And he jumps up and Nev Campbell, bam! Fucking blasts him in the head or the chest or whatever it was. And she says, I remember right as she went to say it, I went, oh, she's going to say, not in my movie. It's like, oh. Talk about bad, corny dialogue and bad delivery. This was bad, George Thorogood. Holy shit, it was terrible. For a movie that riffs on horror movies for being badly scripted and badly acted, that was really bad. Final fucking exclamation point. I really think I hit on most of what I didn't like in this movie. But basically what it boils down to is I think what happened was 1996 came along. Here was a guy who wanted to make a slasher movie. There was a little bit of nostalgia because slasher movies had some dust from sitting on the shelves for a while. And I think enough time had passed between like 1986, 87. Because what happened was you had serious horror. This is a cycle that Harrison Smith on the Cinema podcast, CYNEMA, talks about the cynical nature of the movie business. It's really good. I'm a little more self-indulgent because I look at horror films as a fan. He looks at it as an art form and as a producer, director, writer. So we have a little bit different of an opinion on some of this stuff because we see things differently. But he talks about the cycle that horror films have gone in and they continue to go in. And they started out in the early 1900s with monster movies, these scary, Dracula and the Mummy and Frankenstein. And back then they were scary, Nosferatu. And they're treated seriously as serious films. And then they kind of got played out. And then they threw the monster mashes together. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, right? And then that didn't really work, and it got played out, and then it got comedic. Abbott and Costello meet the Wolfman. They were comedy horror movies, right? So that's the cycle. It was like serious, and then things start to drop off. So they throw a gimmick in there, or in wrestling, as they would call it, hot-shotting. Oh, let's take two iconic personalities and throw them together. Oh, great, that'll work. And it runs out because it doesn't last long. And it's a creatively bankrupt idea because you're just mashing two popular characters together for a cash-in. Then, when that doesn't work, you fucking kick the shit out of it. There's the famous Peter Jackson story. Peter Jackson wrote a treatment for Nightmare on Elm Street Part 6. I think it was Freddy's Dead, the movie that became Freddy's Dead, where Freddy wasn't scary anymore and he lost all his power. And it was a game for kids in Springwood to fall asleep, go into the dream world, and beat the shit out of Freddy. And that's essentially symbolic for this cycle, which is where this film, I think, lies. And in that roundabout time frame, you had serious slasher movies, 78. You had Hitchcock stuff, Carpenter, Bob Clark, Wes Craven. And then you birthed the kind of the gorier slashers, the splatter films. After that ran its course, Freddy started to become Johnny Carson. I fucking hate those later movies. But he becomes Johnny Carson, and it appeals to non-horror movie people. And I think that's why this film was so successful. Because this film took the tropes from other horror films, used them, played on nostalgia, but then tried to pretend they were a different type of movie by calling out their own bullshit. Appealing as, we're not like those other horror movies. We're funny, haha, ha ha ha. I keep doing Mickey Mouse. But it's like whenever normal mainstream people say like, I don't like those Halloween movies, but Silence of the Lambs, that's a good movie. It's like, yeah, it's a horror movie. It's just a little bit different. Call it a psychological thriller, but it's a horror movie. If people say, I don't like Aliens, but I like Jaws. Sorry, Jaws is like the perfect horror movie. Jaws, The Terminator. There's certain films that, because they're not really fish nor fowl, they use elements of both or lean into sci-fi, drama, thriller, psychological, things like that. They kind of get away with calling themselves, not calling themselves horror, and they end up making, money and getting nominated for, Academy Awards and shit. But it's interesting. It was this self-deprecating horror film. And honestly, going back and looking at it, I did not see what everyone else saw. I didn't think it was the worst movie I've ever seen. But I mentioned I wanted to call out the bullshit rules for surviving a horror movie. I know I said I go 30 minutes. We're at 23. The bullshit rules for surviving a horror movie. No self-respecting horror fan that I've ever met on in-person, online, message boards, Facebook groups, whatever the case may be. No one believes the bullshit horror movie rules of you have to be a virgin and you can't have sex and you can't smoke. Ginny Field, Friday the 13th Part 2, a movie they reference in Scream. I believe she smokes pot, she drinks alcohol, she has sex, she survives, and she's the first final girl to fight Jason and survive. So there's that one. And I mean, I'm talking to you, hopefully, we're horror movie fans, so hopefully I don't have to explain to you how that is a trope that kind of got bastardized by people who didn't understand what the early themes of those early slashers were doing and telling. It wasn't that people, you have sex, you die. It wasn't a morality tale originally. It was people aren't paying attention. And even Neve Campbell's character, Sydney, you think she fits in because, she's this virgin and she's not having sex and she's this nice girl. But then she ends up doing that later on, and it kind of goes against type, not because she had sex in a sense, but because she wasn't repressed anymore. Lori was repressed and was shy and was reserved and was withdrawn, and she wasn't partaking in all the other stuff everyone else was doing. So she was paying attention, and she survived. She wasn't distracted by other stuff going on. So I understand they're trying to do something different with Sydney's character and have her buck that trope, because it did become a trope later on, but it's not like a rule of surviving horror movie. So unless that was intended as ironic, I don't know. But they played into all of those, and I just when he named off all these different ones, maybe the "I'll be back" one became a true trope. But like, yeah, no one buys the whole "ooh, you're a virgin, you have to die." Like, I think people have always said that, but I've seen much more like discussion in the past decade of people that I know on message boards are like, yeah, that's horseshit. It's absolute horseshit. It just was a thing that people said and perpetuated. So, yes, there are a lot of virgins that get killed, but it was more or less started off by, repressed people paying attention and being alert, as opposed to not sinning. Dost thou have sins thou wish to confess? So, one last thing that I really, really hated about this movie, and I remember this from when I was watching it as a kid. Ghostface, the killer, get their asses whooped more in this movie than the victims do. Okay? I mean, it's ridiculous. Every time you turn around, they're getting kicked in the nuts, or there's a refrigerator door slammed in their face. Or the one time he looked like, anyone listening or watching, remember Mary Catherine Gallagher from Saturday Night Live? She stuck her hands in her armpits and sniffed her fingers. Yeah, there we go. Knocking the furniture over. Sniffed her fingers when she was nervous, and she'd get excited and jump back and fly through a wall or some shit. That's what it reminded me at some point of. Because you had, like, at one point, like, I think it was in the garage, Rose McGowan was fighting whoever it was, and Ghostface charges her. And she, like, turns around and does some fucking judo throw, backdrop, like fucking Lou Thez or some shit. And the dude falls and almost goes through the garage door. It's like, holy shit. Like, come on, man. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, there was no threat. It was like, oh, he's getting his ass whooped, but he's going to... I don't know. It just really, really... It was too comical. And I think the film, if it had been played straight, at that time may or may not have gotten the attention it got, to be fair. Because it was not at a time when horror movies were really knocking down serious bank at the box office. But... I don't know, man. It just was it was over the top. It was Stooge-like at some point. And not like Evil Dead 2, where it's meaningfully, like, comedic horror. It was like, here's this scene where this person's getting killed by a garage door, and, like, it's a cool kill. It was interesting. But, like, it was just so corny, and the way it was shot, like, it was drawn out and goofy, and it just didn't hit. I'm sorry. Again, I would rather see them play more serious. I don't know if that would have gotten traction at the time. But, maybe this is honestly why Scary Movie was so successful, though, thinking about it again. Because, Scary Movie, all they had to do was take what Scream was doing and just take it a step further with the comedy. Because all Scary Movie did was point out how ridiculous Scream was. To be 100% honest, Scream was, as I mentioned, trying to play it meta and all this stuff, but they were still ridiculous. And Scary Movie just kicked it up an extra notch, so that's why they got 15 fucking movies out of that. So God bless the Wayans brothers. To me, it's the Friends of horror movies, Scream, where it was popular in its time, it caught on, people thought it was great, mainstream audiences, thought it was great. But if you go back and watch, it really, really doesn't hold up at all. And for many of the reasons I just mentioned. There's many more, but these were like the top ones that stuck out that I wanted to hit on. It really just kind of shit on its own genre to try to get over with a different crowd. But when you watch it, it is the same tropes, the same, I don't want to say paint by numbers because they do different things. I mentioned, I don't want to keep mentioning negative stuff because I don't want to harp on it, and we're getting pretty close to time here. I'll say this about the film. For everything that I just said, Wes Craven really knows or knew, God bless him, God rest his soul, how to build suspense. Especially like the early scenes with the Drew Barrymore scenes where, like, one thing that's always freaked me out is when I'm in a house alone at night and the windows are wide open. I remember on Halloween I was goofing on my family and I was wearing the Michael Myers mask when I was a kid. And I remember standing in front of my front window when everyone was inside after trick-or-treating. Kids are going through their candy right, a foot in front of me, in the window on the floor. Parents are playing cards, talking, drinking beer. And I'm standing there in my front window, my parents' front window, for probably 5 or 7 minutes with this mask on, just looking in, waiting for someone to notice me. No one did. That always stuck with me. Like, how at any given moment, someone could be like sitting outside your window, like one of these windows here, and just watching you, being a creepy peeping Tom, a voyeur. And it's like, holy shit. So anytime I see a scene with like wide open windows at night, it always creeps me out a little bit. And the camera work and the pacing at the beginning. Again, some of it was comical. Some of the affect was played for ha-has, and you can tell. But he really knows how to draw tension out of a scene. And again, it's like the Henry Winkler principal scene where he's in the school all alone. And Ghostface comes for him. Guys, it's a 30-year-old fucking movie. I'm not worried about spoilers. And like they really draw out the suspense and the tension in that one scene. But then when Fonzie dies, he's all, it's terrible, man. So I think they did some really good things, but a lot of the affect on it's like watching a porno. This is how I felt. It was like watching a porno. And, things are going well. You're into it. For lack of a better word. You're into it. And right as things take off, the magic bouquet of flowers comes out. And you're like, what the fuck was that? And you're still like, what, what, like, it's like that. Like, come on, man. Like, really? It's like finishing a blowjob with a sandpaper handy. That's what it felt like. There it is. There it is. The magician flowers didn't do it for you. Hopefully that one did. There was some great foreshadowing early on in the first act. There was a cover of the song "Don't Fear the Reaper," and right as Billy, Sidney, they kind of came together and were fooling around. It was supposed to be less like played for this romantic moment for the teen audience and shit, for the high school romance thing. But they're playing Don't Fear the Reaper. And knowing that Billy was the killer, I was like, okay, that was a pretty cool touch. That was a nice little seed planting. And there was a couple more of those things, like Billy and Matthew Lillard. I don't remember the name of the character, but the two killers in the movie, early on at the school, they're talking. They're sitting on these concrete benches. And their interactions, they seem benign unless you know they're the killers. And in a way, this movie reminds me of Friday the 13th Part 5. I normally hate whodunits because to me the payoff is usually pretty terrible. Usually doesn't live up to whatever you're thinking. It's usually a pretty bad explanation. And this one was okay. This one was all right. But it almost reminds me of Friday the 13th Part 5, where if you know it's Roy the ambulance driver and you go back and watch it again, it's actually kind of better because you see Roy playing the scene and realize, okay, you can follow along and things make sense. But you might not have noticed certain things, even though they were kind of obvious with Part 5. In this film, they were obvious, but they weren't because there was so much misdirection, so many red herrings. There were a ton of interesting threads woven through Scream. Again, I think it's a combination of two things with me, guys. Really, honestly, I think it's one, the hype train, because people think it's just amazing, and it's all right. Second, people say it's revolutionary. I don't know if it's revolutionary. I think it just like reminded people of how good, it's like poking the fucking bear. I think it reminded people of how good horror movies were in the 80s, and they could still be that way. Just the general audiences got sick of them and moved on to the new thing. Actually, third thing, for those of you who can fucking count. Obviously, I can't. I think there were some good things that were done, but the punchlines just didn't connect, or were comedically done, or there's some hackiness there and self-deprecation. So, one of the threads was Billy and Sydney's parents. This whole time, Sydney's slowly, her belief in who she's put away as a witness of her mom's murder slowly starts to erode, and then the truth starts to come out about her mom kind of being a slut. A whore. She was a whore. And you find out that she was a whore with Billy's mom with Billy's dad, and caused his mom to run off. Which, spoiler alert, leads to the next film. So, again, I think it was an okay movie. I think it was an alright movie of the time. Honestly, I can name two better ones right now. I've named one, The Faculty. The second one, Urban Legend. Urban Legend is a better movie of the day than Scream. See, I forgot what fucking movie I'm talking about, and I just watched it 20 minutes ago. Honestly, if you want a good movie from that time, that it's kind of self-referential, but it's not. It's got a cool hook with the urban legend type of stuff. And the reveal to me is similar, but more interesting because it does kind of dovetail in with the theme of the movie. Check out Urban Legend. Yes, these movies were like the Dawson's Creek of the era, but like, I just, for all the pomp and circumstance that Scream is getting another movie. I wasn't a huge fan of the Saw franchise. I understand why Saw gets another movie. Scream? I don't. Talk about beating a horse to death, for Christ's sakes. I don't know, man. Scream, what can I say? I hope they make a bunch of money. I hope everyone involved gets paid. I don't wish anything bad. Kevin Williamson, I think, did a good job with some of the scripting, but way too self-indulgent, way too referential. And I know people talk about breaking the fourth wall and meta and stuff like that, but watching this movie back, it really, really was nowhere near as good as people say it is. So that's my take. I'm B. Show Brian. You can follow me on social media at B. Show Brian. You can find this podcast audio form anywhere podcasts are found, or join the Patreon with Break the Apocalypse. $5 a month. You get early access. And I don't know. I think that's it for me. As I mentioned, I'm probably going to be changing the name of Halloween365 just out of respect to someone else who's been doing a podcast for a while, even though I've had the YouTube channel. I'm working on the setup. Hopefully you like it so far. Got to replace it Hulk Hogan with like a Macho Man or an Ultimate Warrior or the Road Warriors or something. But I'm out of time. I'm B. Show Brian. Thanks for checking this out. Also, Scream. Like it, dislike it. Yay or nay? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And also, if you see the new Scream movie on Friday or over the weekend, let me know what you thought. I want to shout out Sam Hoyos of the Red River Podcast, the Horror Nerd Discussion Group. If you're on message boards that are like really shitty and hipster and people are really shitting on each other's opinions, go check out the Horror Nerd Discussion Group from my buddy Sam. It's really cool. Shout out to the NecroManiacs podcast. Shout out to what other horror shows? Break the Apocalypse, obviously. My boys John and Shaheen and I. That's it. I'm out of time. See you guys. Thanks for checking this out, and I will